The golden autumn light filtered through the stained glass windows of Harvard's Sanders Theater, casting prismatic patterns across the gathered crowd of Boston's elite. Dominic "Nick" Callahan adjusted his perfectly tailored navy suit, a reminder of how far he'd come from his humble beginnings in South Boston. At 32, he'd built his educational technology company from the ground up, turning his immigrant grandmother's cramped kitchen table into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that was revolutionizing access to education for underprivileged students. The annual Cambridge Education Foundation Gala was exactly the kind of event he usually avoided, preferring to make his charitable contributions quietly and without fanfare. But Wesley Chen, his best friend and chief technical officer, had insisted that networking was as crucial as innovation in their field. "You can't change the system if you're always outside it," Wesley had argued. And as usual, he was right. Nick scanned the room, noting the subtle indicators of old money that surrounded him: the vintage watches, the inherited jewelry, the comfortable way these people wore their wealth like a second skin. He'd learned to mimic these signals, but sometimes he still felt like an imposter in their world, despite his success. "Mr. Callahan," a voice interrupted his thoughts. "I believe you're sitting at table 7. He turned to thank the event coordinator, but found himself momentarily speechless. The woman before him had striking green eyes that seemed to sparkle with intelligence and warmth. Her dark hair was elegantly swept up, revealing a graceful neck adorned with a simple pearl necklace. She wore a deep emerald dress that complemented both her eyes and the autumn season perfectly. "Please, call me Nick," he managed, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Evelyn Cabot," she replied, her handshake firm and confident. "But everyone calls me Eve. So I'm on the Foundation's board." The Cabot name rang a bell immediately, one of Boston's oldest families with roots going back to the colonial era. Their reputation for both wealth and influence was matched only by their notorious selectivity in social circles. Yet Eve's smile held none of the pretension he'd come to expect from such pedigrees. "The tech entrepreneur, right?" she continued. "I've read about your work bringing advanced STEM programs to underserved schools. It's impressive, and exactly the kind of initiative we need more of." Nick felt his guard lowering slightly. "It's personal for me. I was one of those kids who could have fallen through the cracks if not for a few dedicated teachers and some lucky breaks with technology access. That's exactly why we need people with real-world experience on our board," Eve said, her expression thoughtful. "Listen, I know these events can be a bit stuffy, but I'm hosting a smaller gathering next week, more focused on action than appearances. Would you be interested in joining? We could use your perspective." Before Nick could respond, a distinguished-looking older couple approached. The woman's pearls and perfectly coiffed silver hair practically screamed old money, while the man's bearing suggested years of boarding schools and Ivy League corridors. "Evelyn, darling," the woman called out. "Harrison, look who's here. The Pierces just arrived and they've been asking for you." "Mother, father," Eve acknowledged them with practiced grace. "I'd like you to meet Nick Callahan. His company is doing remarkable work in educational technology." Harrison Cabot's handshake was brief and professionally distant, while Margaret Cabot merely nodded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "How interesting," she murmured, in a tone that suggested quite the opposite. "Evelyn, dear, don't forget you're hosting the symphony board tomorrow. You should really circulate more with our usual crowd." The implied dismissal was clear, but Eve seemed unfazed. "Actually, I was just inviting Mr. Callahan to next week's Education Initiative meeting. His experience would be invaluable." Nick watched the subtle play of emotions across the elder Cabot's faces: surprise, disapproval, resignation, all masked within seconds by practiced social smiles. It was a world he recognized well, having navigated similar waters in countless business meetings, but something about Eve's quiet defiance of these unspoken class boundaries intrigued him. "I'd be honored to attend," he found himself saying, meeting Eve's eyes directly. The brilliant smile she gave him in return made his heart skip a beat. As her parents smoothly steered her away toward other guests, Eve glanced back over her shoulder. "Tuesday at 7, then. I'll have my assistant send you the details." Nick watched her disappear into the crowd, already knowing that his carefully constructed world was about to change drastically. Wesley appeared at his elbow, grinning knowingly. "Don't even start," Nick warned his friend. "Start what?" Wesley's innocent tone fooled no one. I'm just noting that the infamous Eve Cabot seems to have broken her pattern of turning down every eligible bachelor in Boston. Though I should warn you, getting involved with old money families around here is like navigating a minefield in dancing shoes. Nick took a sip of his champagne, considering his friend's words. Maybe it's time someone shook up their world a little. The next week passed in a blur of anticipation for Nick. He threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from thoughts of Eve Cabot and her mesmerizing green eyes. His office in the Seaport District offered a stunning view of Boston Harbor, but today he barely noticed it as he reviewed proposals for expanding their educational programs. "You're doing it again," Wesley commented from the doorway. "That thing where you pretend to read documents while actually staring into space." Nick leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'm just thinking about tonight's meeting." "Right. The meeting. Nothing to do with the gorgeous board member who invited you." Wesley dropped into one of the visitor chairs. "You know I had my team do some research, right?" "Of course you did," Nick sighed. Wesley's protective streak was legendary, a holdover from their college days when they'd bonded over being scholarship students among trust fund kids. "Eve Cabot isn't what you'd expect," Wesley continued. "Harvard Medical School, specialized in pediatrics. Could have joined any prestigious practice, but instead splits her time between a community clinic in Dorchester and her family's philanthropic foundation. The society pages love her, but she's turned down more blue blood suitors than the entire cast of The Bachelor." Nick tried to hide his interest, but Wesley knew him too well. Her family, on the other hand. Harrison Cabot sits on half the prestigious boards in Boston, and Margaret's basically the queen of the social scene. They're old school, like really old school, the kind that still thinks the Kennedys are new money. "I'm not planning to marry her, Wes. It's just a foundation meeting." "In their world, there's no such thing as just anything," Wesley warned. "Every social interaction is calculated. Just be careful, okay?" Later that evening, Nick found himself pulling up to a stunning brownstone in Back Bay. The autumn evening was unusually warm, and the street was lined with trees just beginning to turn golden. Eve greeted him at the door herself, looking effortlessly elegant in a casual black dress. "I'm so glad you came," she said, leading him inside. "Fair warning, my mother invited herself and brought along half her society friends. But don't worry, we'll still get some real work done." The interior of the house was exactly what Nick would have expected from a historic Back Bay residence. Crystal chandeliers, original hardwood floors, priceless artworks on the walls. But Eve had added her own touches. Medical journals mixed with classic literature on the bookshelves, framed photos of her with patients alongside the formal family portraits. The gathering was smaller than the gala, but no less exclusive. Nick recognized several prominent figures from Boston's social and business circles, all of them eyeing him with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Margaret Cabot held court near the fireplace, while Harrison discussed yacht clubs with a judge. "Eve, darling," Margaret called out, "do come here. Judge Morrison was just asking about your cousin Philip's engagement to the Vanderbilt girl." "In a moment, Mother," Eve replied smoothly. "Nick and I were just discussing the potential for expanding our STEM programs to include medical technology training." She guided Nick toward a quieter corner of the room, where a small group was actually discussing educational initiatives. "Sorry about that," she murmured. "Mother's still hoping I'll magically transform into the proper society daughter she always wanted." "And what kind of daughter do you want to be?" Nick found himself asking. Eve's eyes met his, and for a moment, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. "The kind who makes a real difference," she said softly. "The kind who sees people for who they are, not what they own or where they come from." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Autumn Pierce, who Nick recognized as Eve's closest friend from prep school. "Eve, your mother is about to spontaneously combust if you don't at least pretend to be interested in the Vanderbilt engagement," she warned, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Autumn, this is Nick Callahan," Eve introduced them. "Nick, Autumn's our voice of reason on the board, when she's not running her sustainable fashion empire." "Oh, the education tech guy." Autumn's face lit up with genuine interest. "Eve hasn't stopped talking about your program since the gala. Though I'm sure that's not the only reason," she added with a meaningful glance at her friend. Eve blushed slightly, a sight that Nick found utterly charming. "Autumn? Don't autumn me," her friend laughed. Here it's about time you showed interest in someone who actually has a personality and goals beyond maintaining the family yacht. The evening progressed, and Nick found himself drawn deeper into Eve's world, a world of complex social dynamics and unspoken rules, but also one where, at least in some corners, genuine passion for change existed. He watched as she navigated between her mother's social agenda and her own professional goals with graceful determination. As the gathering wound down, Eve walked him to the door. "I hope Mother's friends didn't scare you off," she said. "We do actually accomplish things, despite appearances." "I'm not easily scared," Nick replied, holding her gaze. "Especially not when I find something or someone worth pursuing." Eve's smile was both hopeful and cautious. "Good, because I think Boston's social scene could use a little shaking up, don't you?" As Nick walked to his car, he couldn't help but feel that he was standing on the edge of something both thrilling and dangerous. Wesley's warnings echoed in his mind, but the memory of Eve's smile pushed them aside. Sometimes the biggest risks carried the greatest rewards. He'd built his entire business on that principle. Little did he know just how much his world was about to change. The crisp November air nipped at Eve's cheeks as she hurried through Boston Common, her cream cashmere scarf fluttering in the breeze. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of secret meetings and stolen moments with Nick, each one making it harder to maintain the careful facade she presented to her family's social circle. "You're late," Nick called out, rising from a bench near the frog pond. His smile warmed her more than any scarf could, and she couldn't help but quicken her pace to meet him. "Sorry," she said, accepting his coffee offering. "Mother cornered me about the winter charity ball. Apparently my presence is absolutely essential this year, given that Cousin Philip will be there with his Vanderbilt fiancée." Nick's expression shifted slightly at the mention of her family obligations. They'd been dancing around this topic for weeks, the growing reality that their different worlds weren't as easy to bridge as they'd hoped. "We can't keep this hidden forever," he said softly, falling into step beside her as they began their usual walk through the park. "Your mother's already suspicious about why you've suddenly become so invested in educational technology." Eve sighed, watching a group of children play near the carousel. "I know. But you don't understand how complicated this is. The Cabot name comes with expectations. My father's on the board of practically every major institution in Boston. One wrong move could affect not just our family's standing, but all the charitable work we do. And dating a self-made tech entrepreneur from South Boston counts as a wrong move." There was no bitterness in Nick's voice, just a quiet understanding that made Eve's heart ache. To them, yes. Which is exactly why they're wrong. She stopped walking, turning to face him. "Nick, what we have, it's real. It's more real than anything in that artificial world I grew up in. But if we're going to make this work, we need to be smart about how we handle it." A mischievous glint appeared in Nick's eyes. "I might have an idea about that, but you'll have to trust me. Why do I suddenly feel nervous? Remember how you mentioned your family's looking for a new driver? Since Harrison's longtime chauffeur retired." Nick's grin widened. "What if I told you I know someone perfect for the job?" Eve's eyes widened as she caught his meaning. "Nick, no. You can't be serious." "Think about it," he pressed on, enthusiasm building. "It's the perfect way for me to understand your family's world from the inside, to prove to them that their prejudices about people like me are wrong. Plus, I'd get to see you every day." "It's insane," Eve protested, but she could already feel herself being drawn in by his enthusiasm. "You're a CEO. You can't just become a driver." "Actually, I can. Wesley can handle the day-to-day operations for a few weeks. Besides, how do you think I paid my way through college? I drove for a luxury car service. Still remember all the tricks of the trade." Eve shook her head in amazement. "You're either brilliant or crazy." "Maybe both." "Probably both," Nick agreed, pulling her closer. "But isn't that why you like me?" The autumn sunlight caught in his dark hair, and Eve felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. She'd dated before, proper, parent-approved suitors from the right families with the right connections, but none of them had made her feel this alive, this real. "My parents would never suspect," she mused, warming to the idea despite her reservations. "Father's been complaining about not finding someone trustworthy enough, and Mother's too focused on the winter ball to pay much attention to a new driver." "Exactly. Plus, I've already got Wesley working on creating an impeccable background for my alias. Nothing false, just carefully curated. What about your company? The press might notice if you suddenly disappear. We'll leak a story about me taking a sabbatical to work on new educational initiatives in Europe. Wesley's already lined up some virtual meetings I can do in the evenings to keep up appearances. The more Eve thought about it, the more perfect and terrifying the plan seemed. This is crazy, she repeated, but this time with a smile. If anyone finds out, they won't, Nick assured her. I'll be the model of professional discretion. During the day, I'll be David Sullivan, your family's new driver, with an excellent reference from a private service in New York. And in the evenings, you'll be my secret, Eve finished, heart racing at the thought. But Nick, you have to understand what you're getting into. My parents, their friends, they can be cruel to people they consider beneath them. Are you sure you can handle that? Nick's expression grew serious. Eve, I've spent my whole life proving people wrong about what I can and can't handle. Besides, isn't that exactly why this is important? To understand exactly what we're up against? A gust of wind scattered golden leaves around them, and Eve found herself thinking about all the autumn days she'd spent in this park as a child, always perfectly dressed, always perfectly behaved, always perfectly lonely. Now, standing here with Nick, she felt more authentic than she had in years. Okay, she said finally, but we need rules, boundaries. We can't risk anyone getting suspicious. Of course, I'll be the perfect professional driver in public. No one will ever guess that the scruffy tech CEO they met at the gala and your family's new chauffeur are the same person. Eve couldn't help but laugh. Scruffy? You own more designer suits than half the men in my parents' circle. True, but now I get to rock a proper driver's uniform. I hear the Caps are very distinguished. They spent the next hour walking through the park, planning their elaborate charade. With each detail they discussed, Eve felt both more excited and more terrified. This wasn't just about fooling her parents. It was about challenging the very foundations of the world she'd grown up in. As the afternoon light began to fade, Nick pulled her close one last time before they had to part. Are you sure about this? He asked softly. Once we start, there's no going back. Eve thought about her perfectly planned life, about all the expectations and obligations that had always defined her existence. Then she thought about the way her heart raced every time Nick smiled at her, about the passion she saw in him when he talked about making education accessible to everyone, about the way he made her feel like she could be more than just another Cabot heiress. I'm sure, she said, and sealed their conspiracy with a kiss. 3 days later, David Sullivan reported for his first day of work at the Cabot residence. Nick had spent hours perfecting every detail of his transformation, from the perfectly pressed uniform to the slight New York accent he'd adopted to match his cover story. Wesley had outdone himself, creating a background that would withstand even the most thorough investigation. Harrison Cabot stood in his wood-paneled study, examining Nick's credentials with the same scrutiny he probably applied to major business deals. Your references from the Morrison family in New York are quite impressive, he noted, referring to the genuine recommendations Wesley had secured through his connections. Though I must admit, I'm curious why you chose to relocate to Boston. Family roots, sir, Nick replied smoothly, standing at perfect attention. My grandmother lived here before moving to New York. Always felt drawn to the city. That part at least wasn't a lie. His Irish grandmother had indeed lived in Boston before moving to New York for work, only to return years later with Nick's mother. It was the kind of detail that made the best cover stories work, a foundation of truth wrapped in careful misdirection. Well, your driving record is impeccable, and the Morrisons speak very highly of your discretion. Harrison set down the papers. I suppose we can begin with a trial period. Margaret has several social engagements this week that will require transportation. Of course, sir. I'm familiar with all the major venues in Boston, and I always ensure absolute punctuality. Yes, well, you'll find Mrs. Cabot has very exacting standards. I trust you're prepared for that. Nick thought about all the demanding investors and board members he'd dealt with over the years. I'm quite used to meeting high expectations, sir. As if on cue, Margaret Cabot swept into the study, already dressed for her morning charity committee meeting. Her pearls gleamed in the morning light as she gave Nick a dismissive once-over. Harrison, darling, I'm running late. Is this the new driver? He'll do, I suppose, though he seems rather young. Now Sullivan, was it? The car should be ready in exactly 15 minutes. I have the hospital board at 10, followed by lunch at the Somerset Club, then the Symphony Committee at 2. Yes, ma'am. I'll ensure everything is prepared. Nick bowed slightly and excused himself, catching a glimpse of Eve descending the grand staircase as he left. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw her bite back a smile. The next few hours gave Nick an intimate view of Margaret Cabot's world. From his position in the driver's seat, he observed her interactions with Boston's elite through the privacy partition, the subtle social hierarchies, the casual dismissal of those deemed beneath her station, the carefully orchestrated dance of influence and obligation. "Sullivan," Margaret called through the intercom as they left the hospital board meeting, "will be making an unscheduled stop at Newbury Street. I simply must speak with Charlotte Pierce about the seating arrangements for the winter ball." "Of course, ma'am." Nick smoothly adjusted their route, noting how Margaret never bothered to say please or thank you. He'd expected this kind of treatment, but experiencing it firsthand was different. How had Eve grown up to be so different from this world? The answer came later that afternoon when he drove Eve to her clinic in Dorchester. The contrast between her mother's morning appointments and Eve's dedication to serving underprivileged communities couldn't have been starker. "You're doing amazingly," Eve whispered as he helped her from the car, maintaining a professional distance despite her playful smile. Mother's already told half her friends about her surprisingly competent new driver. "High praise indeed," Nick murmured back, fighting the urge to pull her close. "Though I think your father's still suspicious. Daddy's suspicious of everyone. It's an occupational hazard of sitting on too many boards." Eve adjusted her medical bag. "Will I see you tonight? I believe I'm scheduled to drive you to the foundation meeting at 7. Pure coincidence, of course." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of one of Eve's colleagues, forcing them back into their respective roles. Nick watched her walk into the clinic, marveling at how naturally she moved between these different worlds, her parents' realm of privilege and her chosen path of service. The rest of the week fell into a similar pattern. Nick drove Margaret to her endless social engagements, Harrison to his board meetings, and Eve to her combination of foundation work and clinical practice. Each day taught him more about the complex social web the Cabots inhabited. He learned that Margaret's friendship with Charlotte Pierce was more competition than companionship, that Harrison's business connections were carefully cultivated through years of social maneuvering, and that Eve's resistance to their matchmaking efforts had been a source of tension long before he entered the picture. "The Whitmore boy is asking about you again," he overheard Margaret telling Eve one morning. "His family's philanthropy aligns perfectly with our foundation's goals. I simply don't understand why you won't give him a chance." "Mother, please, I'm focused on my work right now. The clinic is understaffed, and we're expanding our pediatric services." "Darling, your dedication to charity is admirable, but you have obligations to this family. The Cabot name carries certain expectations." Through the rearview mirror, Nick caught Eve's reflection as she stared out the window, her expression a careful mask. He understood then that their masquerade wasn't just about proving himself to her family. It was about Eve's own struggle to reconcile her heritage with her heart. Later that evening, as he drove Eve home from her clinic, she finally let her guard down. "Sometimes I wonder if they'll ever understand," she said softly, watching the city lights blur past the window. "That there's more to life than maintaining the family's social position." "They might surprise you," Nick replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "People can change when they're forced to see the world differently." Is that what this is about? Forcing them to see differently? Maybe it's about all of us seeing differently. Nick met her eyes in the mirror. Your world, my world, maybe they're not as far apart as everyone thinks. Eve's smile held a touch of sadness. "I hope you're right, because I don't think I can go back to their version of normal after this." As Nick pulled up to the Cabot residence, they both knew they were passing a point of no return. Their careful masquerade was more than just a deception. It was becoming a rebellion against the very social structures that had kept them apart. What neither of them realized was that their greatest test was still to come. The winter ball was approaching, and with it came an increasing pressure that seemed to permeate every corner of the Cabot household. Nick, now 2 weeks into his role as David Sullivan, watched through the rearview mirror as Margaret Cabot orchestrated her social empire via phone calls and impromptu meetings. Sullivan will need to make an additional stop at the florist, Margaret announced one particularly hectic morning. The arrangements for the ball simply must be perfect. The Vanderbilts will be attending, and Charlotte Pierce has been insufferable about her daughter's recent engagement party. Of course, Mrs. Cabot. Nick smoothly adjusted their route, catching Eve's subtle eye roll from the back seat. She'd been dragged along for what her mother called proper social training, a morning of vendor meetings for the upcoming ball. The air inside the Rolls-Royce was thick with tension. Nick had learned to read the subtle dynamics between mother and daughter over the past weeks. Today, something was definitely brewing. "Evelyn, darling," Margaret began, her tone carrying that particular note that always preceded a difficult conversation. "Harrison and I have been thinking the winter ball would be the perfect opportunity to announce your appointment as the Foundation's new Director of Medical Initiatives." Eve's head snapped up from her phone. "What?" "Along with your engagement to Thomas Whitmore, of course. His family's healthcare holdings would align perfectly with our charitable works. And the timing couldn't be better with Philip's engagement, already bringing so much positive attention to the family." The silence that followed was deafening. Nick gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to intervene. "Mother," Eve's voice was carefully controlled, "I haven't agreed to any of this, the foundation position or Thomas Whitmore. Don't be difficult, darling. Thomas is perfectly suitable, and you know the foundation needs strong leadership going forward. Your father isn't getting any younger, and the Cabot name must maintain its position in Boston society. I'm already serving the community through my clinic work. Real work, Mother, not just organizing charity balls and posing for society photos." Margaret's pearl bracelet clinked against her phone as she waved dismissively. "The clinic is admirable, dear, but it's time to think about your future, your real future. The Whitmores have expressed serious interest, and Thomas's background in healthcare administration would complement your medical experience perfectly." Nick watched Eve's reflection as she stared out the window at the passing Boston streets. Her face was composed, but he could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. "Sullivan," Margaret's voice cut through the tension, "after the florist, we'll need to stop at Valentino. They're holding several gowns for Evelyn to try. The winter ball announcement must be perfect in every detail." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of high-end boutiques and luxury vendors. Nick opened doors, maintained his professional demeanor, and silently observed as Margaret steamrolled over every one of Eve's attempts to assert independence. It wasn't until late afternoon, when he was driving Eve to her clinic, that they had a moment alone. Margaret had finally been deposited at her salon for her weekly appointment. "I'm sorry you had to witness all that," Eve said quietly, moving to the front passenger seat now that they were alone. Her composed facade had cracked, revealing the turmoil beneath. "Are you okay?" Nick asked, resisting the urge to reach for her hand while they were still in public view. "No," she admitted. "Mother's never been this aggressive about setting me up before. It's like she senses something's different, and she's trying to lock me into her version of my future before I can escape it." They pulled up to a red light, and Nick finally allowed himself to look at her directly. "Is that what you want? An escape? What I want is to be able to love who I choose and do work that matters. Is that really so revolutionary?" Eve's voice caught slightly. "The foundation position. That's just their way of trying to pull me back into their world. Away from the clinic, away from real medicine, away from me?" Nick finished softly. "From everything that makes me feel real." Eve's hand found his briefly as the light turned green. "Nick, we need to tell them. Soon. This masquerade, it's getting too complicated." "The ball," Nick said suddenly. "That's when we'll tell them. Let me keep working from the inside for 2 more weeks, really understand what we're up against. Then at the ball we'll reveal everything." Eve's eyes widened. "At the biggest social event of the season? In front of everyone they're trying to impress? They'll be furious." "Exactly. They won't be able to just brush it under the rug or pretend it didn't happen. They'll have to deal with us, with this head-on. That's either brilliant or absolutely insane. I've found those often go hand in hand." Nick pulled up to the clinic, quickly scanning the street before squeezing her hand one last time. "Trust me?" Eve's smile was both terrified and exhilarated. "Always." What neither of them noticed was Charlotte Pierce's Mercedes parked across the street, or the way her eyes narrowed as she observed their interaction. The storm they'd been sensing was about to break sooner than they'd planned. Back at his office that evening, Nick found Wesley waiting with a concerned expression. "We might have a problem," his friend said without preamble. "Someone's been asking questions about David Sullivan, detailed questions, the kind that make me think they're not buying our cover story." Nick felt his stomach drop. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I had to call in some serious favors to maintain the background we created. Nick, I think someone's onto you." The winter ball was still 2 weeks away. Their carefully constructed plan was starting to unravel, and the consequences of discovery loomed larger than ever. Nick stared out at the Boston skyline, watching as storm clouds gathered over the harbor. They were running out of time. The following week brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at the Cabot residence. Nick felt it the moment he arrived for his morning duties. Subtle glances from the household staff, whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Even Harrison seemed to be watching him more closely, his usual cursory morning instructions now delivered with careful scrutiny. "Sullivan," Harrison called out one morning as Nick was preparing to drive Margaret to her usual round of appointments. "A moment in my study, if you please." Nick followed him into the wood-paneled room, maintaining his carefully constructed persona while his mind raced through possibilities. Had they been discovered? Was their plan already falling apart? "I understand you've been quite attentive to my daughter's schedule," Harrison began, positioning himself behind his massive mahogany desk. "Margaret tells me you've been particularly accommodating about her clinic work." "Miss Cabot's schedule often requires flexibility, sir," Nick replied neutrally. "I simply try to ensure she can fulfill all her obligations efficiently." Harrison's piercing gaze reminded Nick uncomfortably of certain venture capitalists he'd dealt with, the ones who could smell weakness like sharks scenting blood. "Indeed. Tell me, Sullivan, did you enjoy working for the Morrisons in New York?" "A trap. But what kind?" "They were excellent employers, sir. Very similar standards to your own household." "Interesting." Harrison picked up a letter opener, turning it slowly in his hands. "Because I had lunch with James Morrison yesterday. Purely by chance, you understand. And he had no recollection of ever employing a David Sullivan." Nick's heart rate accelerated, but years of high-stakes business negotiations had taught him to maintain his composure. "I actually worked primarily with Mrs. Morrison's household staff, sir. Mr. Morrison was rarely involved in day-to-day operations." "Ah, of course." Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that clears things up nicely. You may go." Nick left the study feeling like he'd just walked through a minefield. Wesley's warning about someone asking questions suddenly felt much more urgent. He needed to warn Eve, but she was already at the clinic, and he was scheduled to drive Margaret to a series of appointments. The morning passed in a blur of tension. Nick maintained his professional demeanor while his mind worked overtime, trying to figure out their next move. Everything had seemed so straightforward when they'd first concocted this plan. Now, the consequences of discovery loomed larger with each passing hour. It wasn't until late afternoon that he finally had a chance to speak with Eve. She'd called for a car to take her from the clinic to a foundation meeting, and for once, they were alone. "We have a problem," he said quietly as soon as they were safely in traffic. "Your father's suspicious. He's been checking my references." Eve's face paled. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. Wesley's doing what he can to shore up our cover story, but..." Nick met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Eve, I think we need to move up our timeline. We can't wait for the ball." "No, we can't risk telling them yet," Eve insisted. "Mother's already pushing this whole Thomas Whitmore situation. If they find out about us now, they'll do everything in their power to keep us apart before we can prove ourselves. And if they discover the truth on their own, that would be even worse." Eve was quiet for a moment, thinking. "The foundation meeting tonight. Thomas will be there. Mother made sure of that. Let me try to handle him first, buy us some time until the ball." "Eve, I know what I'm doing, Nick. Trust me like I trusted you with this whole charade." He wanted to argue, but they were pulling up to the foundation offices. Through the glass doors, Nick could see Thomas Whitmore waiting in the lobby, tall, polished, and looking every inch the Boston Brahmin that the Cabots wanted for their daughter. "Just be careful," Nick said softly as he helped Eve from the car. "This isn't just about us anymore. If they discover who I really am, it could affect your clinic, the foundation's work." "I know." Eve squeezed his hand quickly, hidden from view by the car door. "That's why we have to play this perfectly." Nick watched her walk into the building, saw Thomas's practiced smile as he greeted her, and felt an unfamiliar surge of jealousy. This was exactly the kind of scene Margaret Cabot had been orchestrating. Her daughter and the perfect society match, the merger of two powerful Boston families. Back at the Cabot residence that evening, Nick overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "I'm telling you, Margaret, something isn't right about that driver." Charlotte Pierce's voice drifted from the sitting room. "I saw him with Evelyn outside her clinic. The way they looked at each other, it wasn't appropriate." "Don't be ridiculous, Charlotte. Sullivan comes highly recommended. Besides, Evelyn would never..." "Are you sure? Because I did some asking around in New York. No one seems to remember a David Sullivan working for any of the prominent families there." Nick moved silently past the door, his mind racing. Charlotte Pierce, of course. She'd been watching them, probably hoping to gather ammunition for her endless social competition with Margaret. And now she was turning that weapon on Eve. He needed to talk to Wesley, needed to figure out how to protect Eve from the fallout of their deception. But as he reached for his phone, another voice stopped him cold. "Sullivan." Harrison Cabot stepped out of his study. "I believe we need to have another chat." The storm they'd been dreading wasn't gathering anymore. It had arrived. In his pocket, Nick's phone buzzed with a message from Eve. "Emergency at the clinic. Need you to drive me." Now, he looked at Harrison's stern expression, then at his phone, and realized they were out of time. Whatever happened next would change everything. Nick stood in Harrison Cabot's study, his mind racing between the urgent message from Eve and the steely gaze of her father. The antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick louder with each passing second. "Mr. Cabot, sir," Nick began, careful to maintain his driver's persona. "Miss Cabot has just requested transportation to the clinic. An emergency, it seems." "The clinic can wait," Harrison replied, his voice carrying an edge Nick had never heard before. "Tell me, Sullivan, or whatever your real name is, do you take me for a fool?" Before Nick could respond, his phone buzzed again. Eve's second message made his heart skip. "Patient critical. Please hurry. Sir, with all respect, your daughter's medical duties are none of your concern." Harrison moved to stand directly in front of Nick. "What is your concern, however, is explaining why the Morrison family has no record of you, why your New York references seem to vanish under scrutiny, and why Charlotte Pierce saw you acting far too familiar with my daughter." The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its deep resonance filling the tension-thick air. Nick thought of Eve waiting for him, of a patient possibly in crisis, of all the carefully laid plans crumbling around them. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Cabot," he said, straightening his posture and letting his affected accent drop, "your daughter needs me to drive her to an emergency. When I return, I'll explain everything. You have my word." Harrison's eyes narrowed at the transformation in Nick's demeanor. "You're not going anywhere until..." "Father!" Eve's voice cut through the study as she burst through the door, still in her medical coat. "I need Sullivan to drive me to the clinic now. One of my pediatric patients is having a severe allergic reaction." The look Harrison gave Nick made it clear this conversation was far from over, but even Boston's elite knew better than to interfere with a doctor's emergency. "This isn't finished," he warned as Nick followed Eve to the car. The drive to the clinic was tense with unspoken words. Eve gripped her medical bag tightly, her knuckles white. "Nick, I'm sorry. I know the timing is terrible, but this little girl..." "Don't apologize," Nick interrupted, pushing the car as fast as he safely could through Boston's evening traffic. "Your patients come first. Always. Father knows, doesn't he? He suspects. Charlotte Pierce has been watching us, and the New York cover story is falling apart." Nick navigated through a yellow light, earning a horn blast from another driver. "But right now, focus on your patient. We'll deal with everything else after." They reached the clinic in record time. As Eve rushed inside, Nick noticed a familiar Mercedes parked across the street, Charlotte Pierce's car. She was watching them again, probably gathering more ammunition for her social warfare. Instead of letting it rattle him, Nick made a show of being the perfect professional driver, standing at attention by the car, every inch the dedicated servant. Let Charlotte watch. They had bigger concerns now. Through the clinic windows, he could see Eve working with her team, their movements urgent but coordinated. This was her real world, far from the glittering ballrooms and charity galas her mother preferred. Here, she was saving lives, making a real difference. An hour passed before Eve emerged, exhaustion evident in her face but relief in her eyes. "She's stable," she said simply as Nick opened the car door. "We got to her in time." As they drove back to the Cabot residence, the adrenaline of the emergency faded, leaving them to face the reality of their situation. "We can't go back to your house," Eve said suddenly. "Not tonight." Not with father in this mood, and Charlotte Pierce probably already spreading rumors through their entire social circle. Where then? The apartment. Nick glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Eve, I know it's risky, but I need to think, to plan our next move. And I can't do that under their roof tonight." The apartment was Nick's personal refuge in the Seaport district, a place where they'd spent precious stolen hours over the past weeks. Going there now with suspicions already high was dangerous, but one look at Eve's determined expression told him this wasn't up for debate. He made a quick call to Wesley as they drove. "They're on to us. How bad is the damage control?" "Pretty bad," his friend replied. "Pierce has been calling every social connection in New York. It's only a matter of time before someone connects David Sullivan to Nick Callahan." "How much time?" "Maybe hours." The society blogs are already buzzing about the mysterious new Cabot driver and Eve's sudden interest in educational technology. Eve leaned forward from the back seat. "Wesley, can you do damage control for one more day? Just until we can figure out how to handle this on our terms?" "I'll do my best, but you two need to have a plan. Fast. The winter ball is still a week away. You might not make it that long." As they pulled into the private garage of Nick's building, both of them knew they were crossing a line. Eve Cabot, pride of Boston society, spending the night at her driver's apartment. It would be a scandal that would rock their social circles to the core. But as the elevator carried them up to Nick's floor, Eve reached for his hand. "I won't let them destroy what we have," she said softly. "Not when I've finally found something real." Nick pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Then we fight. But first, we need a better plan than me pretending to be your driver." "Actually," Eve said, a familiar determined glint in her eye, "I think I might have an idea, but you're going to have to trust me completely." "Always," Nick replied, not knowing that Eve's plan would test that trust in ways neither of them could imagine. Eve's plan, as it turned out, was either brilliant or desperate, possibly both. Standing in Nick's minimalist living room overlooking the glittering lights of Boston Harbor, she laid it out with the same precision she used in the operating room. "The foundation board meets tomorrow morning," she began, pacing the hardwood floors. "They're voting on the new medical initiative director, the position mother and father want me to take." Nick watched her from the kitchen counter where he was making them tea, a domestic moment that felt surreal given the chaos swirling around them. "The position they want to use to control you." "Exactly. But what if we turned it against them?" Eve's eyes sparkled with determination. "What if, instead of running from their world, we used it to prove exactly why their prejudices are wrong?" "I'm listening." "Your company's educational technology program. It's exactly what the Foundation needs for its medical training initiative. The board knows it, which is why they've been trying to partner with you for months. But instead of working through the usual social channels, we go in the front door," Nick finished, understanding dawning. "No more hiding, no more games. We present a united front. The brilliant doctor and the tech innovator working together to revolutionize medical education access." "Better yet," Eve continued, accepting the cup of tea he offered, "we do it at tomorrow's board meeting. Before Charlotte Pierce can spread more rumors, before Mother can push the Thomas Whitmore agenda any further. Your father will be there." "Good." Eve's voice was firm. "Let him see exactly who you are. Not the fake driver he's investigating, but the man who built an empire from nothing, who shares my vision for actually making a difference in people's lives." Nick set down his tea, thinking it through. "It's risky. If they reject the proposal out of spite, they won't. The Whitmore family's been trying to get their healthcare technology into the Foundation's programs for years. When the board sees what your company can offer, actual innovation instead of repackaged old systems, they'll have to listen. And when they realize you're the mysterious driver who's been right under their noses, they'll be horrified," Nick pointed out. "They'll be fascinated," Eve corrected. "You know how their world works, Nick. Nothing gets their attention like a good scandal, and nothing earns their respect like success they can't ignore. By this time tomorrow, you'll be the talk of Boston society. the self-made millionaire who went undercover as a driver to understand the foundation from the inside. And your parents? Eve's confidence faltered slightly. They'll be angry, humiliated probably, but they'll also be trapped. Once the board approves our proposal, and they will, Mother and Father won't be able to oppose our relationship without jeopardizing the foundation's future. It's manipulative, Nick said softly. We learned from the best. Eve's smile was bittersweet. Besides, isn't this better than continuing the lie? This way, we're using their own system to prove exactly why their prejudices are wrong. Nick pulled up the foundation's financial reports on his tablet, his business instincts kicking in. We'll need to modify my company's standard proposal, show them something they've never seen before, something that combines your medical expertise with our technology. Already thinking about it, Eve pulled out her clinic notes. What if we focused on remote training for rural medical providers? Use your virtual reality systems to create immersive learning experiences for doctors in underserved areas. They spent the next several hours working, their different worlds merging into something new and exciting. Eve's understanding of medical needs complemented Nick's technological innovations perfectly, creating a proposal that could genuinely change lives. As the night deepened, they finally took a break, standing together at the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights reflected off the harbor, creating a magical atmosphere that felt removed from the drama of their situation. What if it doesn't work? Nick asked quietly. What if they can't see past their prejudices? Eve turned to face him, her expression serious. Then we'll know we tried it their way, and if they still can't accept us, we'll find our own path. I won't let them dictate my future anymore. Nick's phone buzzed. Another message from Wesley. Charlotte Pierce is planning to attend tomorrow's board meeting. Apparently she's pushing for Thomas Whitmore's healthcare technology proposal. Perfect, Eve said, surprising him. Let her come. Let her see exactly who she's been spying on. In fact, she paused, a new idea forming. Call Wesley back. Call. I think we can use Charlotte's presence to our advantage. As Eve outlined the final details of her plan, Nick realized that the society princess he'd met at that first gala was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned to play her parents' game, but by her own rules. Morning would bring either triumph or disaster, but as they worked through the night, fine-tuning their presentation and strategy, one thing was clear. There was no going back to the careful masquerade of the past weeks. Tomorrow would change everything. In the pre-dawn hours, Eve finally fell asleep on Nick's couch, surrounded by medical papers and technology specs. Looking at her, Nick felt a fierce surge of pride and protection. Whatever happened at the board meeting, he knew they were doing the right thing. His phone buzzed one final time, a message from Harrison Cabot. I expect to see both you and my daughter at the foundation offices first thing tomorrow morning. No more games. Nick sent back a simple reply. Understood, sir, and I promise you won't be disappointed. The sunrise was just beginning to paint the Boston skyline in shades of gold and pink. In a few hours they would face the music, but for now Nick let Eve sleep, watching the city wake up and thinking about how one chance meeting at a charity gala had led them here. Sometimes, he reflected, the biggest risks brought the greatest rewards. Tomorrow would prove if he was right. The foundation's boardroom buzzed with tension as Boston's elite filed in for the morning meeting. Every leather chair around the massive mahogany table represented decades, sometimes centuries, of social influence and family connections. Nick stood at the window, no longer in his driver's uniform but wearing one of his finest suits, watching the familiar faces arrive. Wesley had outdone himself preparing for this moment. The presentation materials were flawless, the technology demonstrations ready, and a carefully crafted press release waited in the wings. More importantly, he'd arranged for several key technology journalists to be coincidentally present in the building for another story. They're here, Eve said softly, joining him at the window. She looked immaculate in a tailored emerald green suit that managed to convey both professional authority and her family's social status. Mother, father, and, yes, Charlotte Pierce, with Thomas Whitmore. Nick squeezed her hand briefly. Ready? Born ready. Eve's smile held a hint of steel. Let's show them exactly what we can do together. The room fell silent as Harrison and Margaret Cabot entered, followed closely by Charlotte Pierce and Thomas Whitmore. The moment Harrison spotted Nick standing beside Eve, his face darkened with understanding and barely contained fury. "What is the meaning of this?" Margaret demanded, her social mask slipping slightly. "Evelyn, why is our driver—" "Mrs. Cabot," Nick stepped forward, his voice carrying the same authority he used in corporate boardrooms. "I believe a proper introduction is long overdue. I'm Nicholas Callahan, CEO of Callahan Tech Education Systems. You might remember meeting me at the Cambridge Education Foundation Gala." The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte Pierce's triumphant expression faltered as she realized she hadn't been the first to uncover the truth. Thomas Whitmore looked between Eve and Nick with dawning comprehension. "You—" Harrison's voice was dangerous and quiet. "You infiltrated my household, spied on my family." "No, Father." Eve stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Nick. "He helped me see our world through fresh eyes, and today we're here to show you something that could transform the Foundation's impact on medical education forever." "This is preposterous," Margaret sputtered. "Evelyn, you can't seriously expect us to—" "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Eve's voice cut through the chaos with professional precision, "you've all received the proposal for our new medical education initiative. What you don't know is that it represents a revolutionary partnership between Callahan Tech's virtual reality systems and our Foundation's medical training programs." Nick smoothly took control of the presentation screen, and suddenly the boardroom was filled with holographic images of operating rooms, training scenarios, and real-time medical simulations. The technology was cutting-edge, far beyond anything Thomas Whitmore's family company had proposed. "Imagine bringing world-class medical training to every corner of Massachusetts," Eve continued, her passion evident in every word. "Rural clinics, underserved communities, places that have never had access to advanced medical education. Now imagine doing it at a fraction of the traditional cost." The board members leaned forward, their initial shock giving way to genuine interest. Even Charlotte Pierce couldn't hide her fascination with the technology on display. "This is why you've been spending so much time at that clinic," Margaret said slowly, realization dawning. "You've been testing this system." "Yes, Mother, and the results have been extraordinary. Our pilot program has already improved diagnostic accuracy by 40% among rural providers." Nick stepped forward. "Board members, I apologize for the unusual circumstances of our introduction, but I needed to understand this foundation from the inside, not just its public face, but its true potential for creating change. By deceiving us." Harrison's voice was cold. "By taking advantage of my daughter." "No, sir." Nick met his gaze steadily. "By falling in love with her. Everything else, the deception, the masquerade, that was my choice. Eve wanted to tell you the truth from the beginning." "And you think this technical wizardry makes up for your lies?" Margaret demanded. "That it erases the scandal you've created?" "Actually, Mrs. Cabot," Wesley spoke up from the back of the room, "the press seems to find it rather romantic. The self-made tech innovator going undercover to understand a traditional charitable foundation from the ground up. It's already trending on social media." Charlotte Pierce's face showed a calculating shift. Nick had seen that expression before, the moment when Boston's elite recognized a potential social advantage. "It is rather fascinating," she mused, "almost like something from a novel." "Fascinating." Margaret turned on her friend. "Charlotte, surely you can't be suggesting—" "Think about it, Margaret." Charlotte's voice took on the smooth tone of the social operator she was. "Your daughter, the brilliant doctor, and her secret romance with a tech genius who went undercover to prove himself worthy. The society papers will talk about it for years. Every major philanthropic organization in the country will want to replicate their medical education program." The other board members were nodding now, seeing the potential that Charlotte had so quickly grasped. Even Thomas Whitmore looked impressed, though perhaps a bit relieved to be freed from the matchmaking scheme. Harrison Cabot stood silently through this exchange, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned to Nick. "You engineered all of this, didn't you? The driver position, the press coverage, the timing of this presentation." "No, sir," Nick replied honestly. "I only wanted to understand your world before asking for your daughter's hand. Everything else, including this moment, was Eve's plan." Harrison's eyes shifted to his daughter, and for the first time, Nick saw something like respect in his expression. Eve stood tall under her father's scrutiny, every inch the Cabot heir, but also unmistakably her own person. Well played, Harrison said finally. You've learned our game well, Evelyn. I learned from the best, Father, Eve replied, but I'm not playing games anymore. Nick and I want to make real change in the world. The only question is whether you'll be part of it or stand in our way. The boardroom waited in tense silence for Harrison's response. The future of not just Eve and Nick's relationship, but potentially the entire foundation hung in the balance. Harrison Cabot's response came in the form of a quiet chuckle that caught everyone by surprise. Did you know, he said, addressing the board but looking at Nick, that I spent 3 months working as a dock worker in South Boston before taking over my father's company? Margaret's eyes widened. Harrison! It was 1982, he continued, ignoring his wife's scandalized expression. My father insisted I understand every level of our shipping business before he'd let me near the executive floor. I thought he was punishing me. Turned out to be the most valuable experience of my life. Eve stepped forward. Father, the difference, Mr. Callahan, is that I did it with my father's knowledge and blessing. Harrison's voice carried a hint of steel. But I must admit, your methods, while unorthodox, show a similar dedication to understanding our world from the ground up. The tension in the room shifted subtly. Board members exchanged glances, sensing the wind changing direction. Charlotte Pierce, ever the social weather vane, smiled knowingly. Perhaps, Harrison continued, we should focus on the proposal before us. Evelyn, would you and Mr. Callahan walk us through the financial projections? For the next hour, Eve and Nick presented their vision in detail. The technology was revolutionary. Virtual reality systems that could train medical professionals across the state, interactive simulations that could save hospitals millions in training costs, and real-time consultation capabilities that could bring specialist expertise to the most remote clinics. The potential return on investment is remarkable, Thomas Whitmore admitted, studying the numbers. My family's company has been working on similar concepts, but nothing this advanced. Because you've been developing it from the top down, Nick explained. We built this system based on real needs we observed in Eve's clinic. Every feature addresses a specific challenge faced by medical professionals in underserved communities. Margaret Cabot, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. And this partnership. It's not just about business, is it? Eve met her mother's gaze steadily. No, Mother. Nick and I want to build something meaningful together, in every sense. But we're not asking for permission. We're offering you the chance to be part of it. Bold words, Margaret said softly. You truly are your father's daughter. Actually, Harrison interjected, in this case, I'd say she's very much her mother's daughter. Or have you forgotten your own family's reaction when you announced you were marrying a Cabot instead of the banking heir they'd chosen for you? Color rose in Margaret's cheeks. That was different. Was it? Harrison's voice held a gentle challenge. You chose love over social expectations, despite the consequences. Our daughter is simply following in your footsteps, albeit with considerably more strategic planning. Charlotte Pierce leaned forward, her social instincts razor-sharp as always. Margaret, darling, think of the possibilities. The annual ball could focus on medical technology this year. We could invite Silicon Valley philanthropists, merge old money with new innovation. It would be unprecedented. The board members were nodding enthusiastically now, already seeing the social and financial advantages of the partnership. Even Thomas Whitmore looked intrigued by the possibilities. There is, however, one condition, Harrison said, his expression serious. No more deceptions, Mr. Callahan. If you want to be part of this family, personally or professionally, I expect absolute honesty going forward. You have my word, sir, Nick replied. Though I hope you'll keep David Sullivan's excellent driving record on file just in case. The tension in the room broke with scattered laughter. Eve slipped her hand into Nick's, no longer hiding their connection. Well then, Harrison stood, straightening his tie. I believe we have a proposal to vote on. Unless there are any objections. The vote was unanimous. As board members gathered their papers and began to leave, chattering excitedly about the possibilities ahead, Charlotte Pierce approached Eve and Nick. I must say, you two have given me enough social gossip to last through the next 3 seasons, she said with a sly smile. Though I do expect an exclusive when you announce the engagement. Charlotte, Margaret protested, but there was less heat in her voice now. Oh, come now, Margaret. You know as well as I do, that this is the most exciting thing to happen in Boston society since the Kennedys. We might as well embrace it. As the boardroom cleared, Eve and Nick found themselves alone with her parents. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. "I suppose I should be grateful you didn't announce it at the winter ball as originally planned," she said. "Though I must admit, that would have been rather dramatic." Eve and Nick exchanged startled looks. Harrison smiled. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? The ball invitations, the timing of the driver's retirement, the sudden interest in medical technology? Give your father some credit, Evelyn." "How long have you known?" Nick asked. "Long enough to do my own background check on you, Mr. Callahan. Your rise from South Boston to tech CEO is quite impressive. Though I must say your driving skills weren't bad either. Does this mean—" Eve looked between her parents hopefully. "This means," Margaret interjected, "that we have a great deal of planning to do. The foundation's public announcement, the engagement party, and everything must be perfect." "Mother, we haven't even—" "Please, Evelyn. I saw the way you two look at each other. I may be traditional, but I'm not blind." Margaret's expression softened. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "When you do have the wedding, let me help plan it, and perhaps we could discuss a slightly larger apartment than that place in the Seaport District." Eve laughed, tears of joy threatening to spill. "One step at a time, Mother. One step at a time." As they left the foundation offices together, no longer hiding their relationship, Nick and Eve knew that challenges still lay ahead. But they had done what seemed impossible, bridged the gap between their worlds, and proved that love could transcend social boundaries. The Boston skyline stretched before them, familiar yet somehow new, full of possibilities they would explore together. The winter ball arrived on a perfect December evening, snowflakes dancing in the golden light that spilled from the windows of the Somerset Club. Unlike the original plan for a dramatic revelation, this event now served a different purpose: the official introduction of Nick Callahan to Boston society as Eve's fiancé and the Foundation's new technology partner. "Ready for this?" Eve asked, adjusting Nick's bow tie in the car. Their driver, a real one this time, was taking them on the same route Nick had driven so many times before. "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" Nick caught her hand, kissing her palm. "This is your world we're about to face." "Our world now," Eve corrected him. "Though I must say I'm going to miss having you as my personal chauffeur." The past month had been a whirlwind of changes. The Foundation's medical technology initiative had garnered national attention, with hospitals across the country expressing interest in their training program. Eve's clinic had become the pilot site for the new system, transforming how they trained medical staff and treated patients. More surprisingly, Harrison Cabot had thrown himself into the project with unexpected enthusiasm. His business acumen, combined with Nick's technological innovation and Eve's medical expertise, had created a partnership that was revolutionizing medical education access. The car pulled up to the Somerset Club's entrance, where Margaret Cabot waited to greet them. Her initial resistance had melted into careful acceptance, especially after seeing the social cachet their story had generated. Charlotte Pierce's prediction had proven correct. Boston society was captivated by the romance of it all. "Darling," Margaret air-kissed Eve's cheeks, then surprised Nick by giving him the same greeting. Everyone simply buzzing about the Foundation's announcement. The governor himself asked to be seated at your table. The ballroom was a winter wonderland of crystal and silver, Margaret's impeccable taste evident in every detail. Nick recognized many faces from his days as David Sullivan, society matrons who had barely acknowledged his existence, now eager to claim acquaintance with the innovative tech CEO who had captured Eve Cabot's heart. "Nick!" Wesley appeared with champagne, grinning broadly. "The press release about the medical training program just hit the wire. We're already getting calls from Silicon Valley investors." "Evening, Wesley." Harrison joined them, clapping Wesley on the shoulder with unexpected warmth. The two had formed an unlikely alliance over the past month, working together to expand the Foundation's technological capabilities. "I hear the Whitmore family is interested in a partnership," Wesley continued. "Thomas seems quite enthusiastic about collaborating rather than competing." "Yes, well," Harrison's eyes twinkled. "Thomas has been spending quite a bit of time with young Dr. Chen from the clinic. Apparently your influence is spreading, Nicholas." Eve, who had been greeting Foundation board members, rejoined them just in time to hear this. "Really? Sarah Chen and Thomas Whitmore. Now that's an interesting development. Indeed, Margaret appeared at Harrison's elbow. Charlotte Pierce is already planning how to spin it for the society pages. 2 revolutionary medical partnerships in 1 season. She's beside herself with excitement. The evening progressed like a dream, so different from the tense galas of months past. Nick watched Eve work the room, her natural grace now unburdened by secrets. She was magnificent, seamlessly bridging their different worlds, equally comfortable discussing virtual reality protocols with tech investors and charitable initiatives with society patronesses. "She's quite something, isn't she?" Harrison said quietly, joining Nick by the windows where he'd stepped away for a moment of reflection. "She is," Nick agreed. "I hope you know I never meant to deceive her. The driver scheme was entirely my idea." "Oh, I know." Harrison sipped his scotch. "Just as I know it was her idea to turn it into an advantage for the Foundation. She's more like me than I ever realized, or perhaps wanted to admit. She's the perfect blend of both you and Mrs. Cabot," Nick observed. "Your business sense, and her mother's social grace, but with her own unique vision." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when I married Margaret, her family thought I was barely 1 step up from the dock workers I'd worked alongside. Old shipping money wasn't quite the same as their banking fortune, but Margaret saw something in me worth fighting for. Like mother, like daughter." "Indeed." Harrison turned to face Nick fully. "I wasn't entirely honest in the boardroom that day. I didn't just suspect your true identity. I knew who you were the entire time." Nick's surprise must have shown on his face because Harrison chuckled. "Give me some credit, son. Did you really think I wouldn't thoroughly investigate anyone showing interest in my daughter, especially after that first Foundation meeting? Then why did I let the charade continue?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "Because I wanted to see what kind of man you really were, how you'd treat people when you thought no one important was watching, how you'd handle pressure, disrespect, social prejudice. And you proved yourself far more worthy than any of the suitable young men we'd chosen for her. You showed genuine interest in our Foundation's work, treated everyone with respect regardless of their position, and most importantly, you made my daughter happier than I've ever seen her." Before Nick could respond, Eve appeared at his side. "There you are. Father, you're not interrogating my fiancée again, are you?" "Simply sharing some family history, my dear." Harrison kissed her cheek. "Your mother needs you both for the Foundation announcement photos." As they made their way back to the center of the ballroom, Nick marveled at how much had changed since that first gala where he'd met Eve. The same crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. The same society figures circulated with their practiced smiles, but everything felt different. He was no longer an outsider looking in, nor a spy trying to understand this world. He had found his place, not by conforming to their expectations, but by staying true to himself and his values. And in Eve, he'd found someone who shared those values while helping him navigate this complex social landscape. The photographer gathered them together. Eve, Nick, her parents, Wesley, Foundation board members, and even Charlotte Pierce insisted on being included. As camera flashes lit up the ballroom, Nick felt Eve squeeze his hand. "Happy?" she whispered. "More than I ever imagined possible," he replied, and knew that their greatest adventures were still to come. Spring arrived in Boston with a burst of cherry blossoms and new beginnings. The public garden was in full bloom as Eve and Nick strolled along their favorite path, retracing the routes they'd walked during their secret meetings months ago. "Hard to believe it's been 6 months since the winter ball," Eve mused, her engagement ring catching the morning light. They were headed to the Foundation's new Medical Technology Center, housed in a renovated historic building that perfectly symbolized their successful merger of tradition and innovation. "Harder to believe your mother actually approved of us having the wedding at the clinic instead of the Somerset Club," Nick replied, still amazed by how much Margaret Cabot had evolved in her acceptance of their relationship. "Well, having the governor and half of Silicon Valley's philanthropic community on the guest list helped," Eve laughed. "Plus, it fits perfectly with the Foundation's new image. Charlotte Pierce is already calling it the social event of the decade. Medicine meets technology, a modern fairy tale." The Medical Technology Center was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Medical students from across the state were training on their virtual reality systems, while rural doctors connected remotely for specialist consultations. Wesley was leading a group of international healthcare executives through a demonstration of their latest innovations. Dr. Cabot! Sarah Chen, now the clinic's chief resident, hurried over with a tablet. The results from the rural training program just came in. We've seen a 60% improvement in diagnostic accuracy across all participating clinics. That's fantastic, Eve beamed, reviewing the data. Have you shared this with Thomas? The Whitmore Group will want to include it in their implementation proposal. Already done, Sarah blushed slightly. He's actually waiting upstairs with the new investor group. Nick and Eve exchanged knowing smiles. The budding romance between Sarah and Thomas had been an unexpected but welcome development, further bridging the gaps between their different worlds. Harrison Cabot's voice carried from the conference room as they approached. The Foundation's partnership with Callahan Tech has revolutionized how we approach medical education. But perhaps more importantly, it's shown us that true innovation comes from breaking down traditional barriers. They entered to find Harrison presenting to a group of potential investors, his natural authority now tempered with genuine passion for their mission. Margaret sat beside him, her social expertise now focused on building meaningful connections between technology innovators and healthcare providers. Ah, perfect timing. Harrison beckoned them forward. Ladies and gentlemen, my daughter Eve and her fiancé Nick Callahan, the architects of our medical training initiative. As they took their places at the presentation, Nick was struck by how natural it felt now, this blend of his technological world with the Cabot's social influence, all focused on creating real change in healthcare access. The meeting was a success, with new partnerships formed and expansion plans approved. Afterward, as they gathered in Harrison's office, Margaret surprised them with an announcement of her own. I've been thinking, she began, uncharacteristically hesitant. The Foundation's scholarship program, perhaps we should expand it to include technology training for students from underprivileged backgrounds, similar to your own journey, Nicholas. Eve squeezed Nick's hand, both of them recognizing the significance of Margaret's suggestion. The woman who had once dismissed him as merely a driver was now championing opportunities for others like him. That's an excellent idea, Mother, Eve said warmly. In fact, I know several promising students at the clinic who could benefit from such a program. Charlotte Pierce has already offered to co-chair the fundraising committee, Margaret added, growing more animated. She thinks we could make it the Foundation's signature initiative, breaking barriers in medicine and technology. Speaking of breaking barriers, Harrison interjected, Nicholas, that brings us to something Eve's mother and I have been discussing. We'd like you to consider taking a more formal role in the Foundation's leadership. Nick looked at Eve, who seemed as surprised as he was. Sir, the Medical Technology Center is just the beginning, Harrison continued. Your vision, combined with Eve's medical expertise and our Foundation's resources, we could transform healthcare access across the country. But to do that, we need someone who understands both the technological and human aspects of innovation. We'd be working together, Eve realized, her eyes shining. All of us as a family. Family. The word hung in the air, full of meaning. Nick thought about how far they'd come from that first meeting at the gala, from his days pretending to be David Sullivan, from all the careful maneuvering and social prejudices they'd overcome. I'd be honored, he said simply, and felt the last pieces of their two worlds click perfectly into place. Later that evening, they returned to the public garden, drawn to the place where they'd planned their elaborate charade months ago. The spring air was soft with promise, cherry blossoms drifting on the breeze like nature's celebration. Do you ever regret it? Eve asked suddenly. The whole driver scheme? It could have gone so wrong. Nick pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. Never. Every moment, even the uncomfortable ones, led us here. Though I have to admit, I don't miss that uniform. I don't know, Eve teased. You did look rather dashing in it. Very James Bond meets Downton Abbey. Well, Mrs. Almost Callahan, I might still have it somewhere if you're feeling nostalgic. Their laughter echoed across the garden, joining the chorus of spring birds and distant city sounds. They had faced society's prejudices, family expectations, and their own fears, emerging stronger for every challenge overcome. As the sun set over Boston's skyline, painting the city in shades of gold and promise, Nick and Eve walked hand in hand through the garden where their story had truly begun. They had proven that love could bridge any social divide. that tradition and innovation could work in harmony, and that sometimes the greatest adventures start with a simple chance meeting at a charity gala. Their story had become more than just a romance. It was a testament to the power of authenticity over appearance, of substance over social status, of love over prejudice. And as they looked toward their future together, they knew that this was just the beginning of their greatest collaboration yet. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, but the garden still glowed with the last light of day. Much like their love story continued to illuminate the paths of others who dared to challenge society's expectations. In the end, they had created something revolutionary, not just in medical technology, but in the way Boston's social circles viewed success, status, and the true meaning of family. And somewhere in the depths of the Cabot's garage, a chauffeur's uniform hung unworn but not forgotten, a reminder that sometimes the most direct route to love requires a few unexpected detours along the way.